Hello, my name is Darrell James. I'm the Executive Director for the Montana Infrastructure Coalition. We're an organization made up of over 100 members who are involved in the design, securement of funding, ownership, operation, and maintenance of critical infrastructure across Montana. We were formed about 3 or 4 years ago out of necessity, and our efforts are focused on finding ways to sustainably fund critical infrastructure over the long term. I have a couple of our members with me this morning. Eric Bryson is Executive Director for the Montana Association of Counties, representing all of Montana's 56 counties. And Tim Burton is the Executive Director for the Montana League of Cities and Towns, representing all of our 127 cities and towns across the state. We wanted to chat with you this morning a little bit about what the Infrastructure Coalition is doing, what MACO and the League are doing with regard to infrastructure funding in particular, but also in regard to COVID relief. We're certainly operating in a different world today with COVID response, and we want to share some of our thoughts about how both state and federal governments are responding to the COVID crisis and things that we might see necessary as we move forward. You know, when we think about the COVID crisis, not just the health crisis, but the financial crisis, I think people tend to focus on the personal income loss, the business income loss, and that's been pretty dire. It's been pretty dramatic. But we tend to think less about some of the trickle-down impacts, and that's the impacts on those revenues to state and local governments. As personal income drops, as business income drops, those tax revenues to the state decrease and has a direct and immediate impact on the ability of the state to provide things like health and human services. We often think less even about the impact on local governments when those folks are having a hard time making ends meet with their personal income or with their business income. They're likely to default on property tax payments. Those delinquencies have an immediate impact on local governments and their ability to provide emergency services at the local level, our ability to fund schools, and certainly our ability to fund critical infrastructure across Montana. So we want to talk a little bit about what those responses might look like, what we're seeing in the state, and try to provide a little clear thinking in the midst of a storm, which is oftentimes difficult. When you think about what we're enduring right now, we've got a global pandemic in the midst of a national campaign cycle, and that's the makings of either a disaster or a real opportunity to pull together and provide some collaboration. In fact, as the Infrastructure Coalition, the MACO and the League, I think we're interested in really facilitating and helping drive a productive discussion about how we get folks back on their feet and how we think long-term critically about how we fund essential services at the local level, and particularly local infrastructure. Thank you. Over the last several years, members of the Infrastructure Coalition have spent a fair amount of time discussing how to prioritize infrastructure investment. And to set the stage for our dialogue today, it might be helpful to view COVID response and recovery akin to how one might formulate a coordinated response to a natural disaster. We start with the hardest hit areas first to restore basic health and safety standards, and then you shore up your ability to provide essential services like healthcare, communications, and power. Then you move on to rebuilding critical infrastructure necessary for our businesses to function and our families and communities to thrive. Eric, as we watched the federal COVID relief packages roll out from the Treasury, it was hard to imagine how Montana would be able to identify enough direct COVID-related expenses to fully distribute the available monies. But beyond the unplanned expenses related to COVID, counties are grappling with the loss of revenues that will impact even routine budget expenditures. What are you hearing from your member counties on the existing federal relief program, and what additional steps do you see necessary from both the state and the federal levels to ensure that Montana counties can continue to provide those essential services? And Eric, if you just kind of remind folks of who you represent, what MACO does, and then give us your perspective on a COVID relief package.
Sure, and thank you, Darrell, for the question. I think the setup is appropriate, given the prioritization that we've all had to adjust to really from March 12th on to the current day today. I am Eric Bryson. I'm the Executive Director of the Montana Association of Counties. We are a member service organization that does everything from advice to liability and insurance protection for our member counties. We do health insurance, we do work comp, but we're mostly just a member services organization that strives for good governance and advocacy on behalf of Montana counties. And along those lines, as you articulated in the beginning of the question, the frontline response for COVID-19, the pandemic that has hit the United States and all across the world, that frontline response in the United States has been borne primarily by your local governments. Your first responders in the field, your law enforcement that are out there doing everything from education to social distancing enforcement, your public health folks that are out there are all county and city and town employees. This pandemic, like many natural disasters in the United States, is uniquely borne by local governments, and thus the response has been a burden that local governments have absorbed from the beginning of this pandemic to the current day. In light of that, we were thankful that the federal legislation went through that produced the CARES Act, which ultimately resulted in about $1.25 billion coming to the state of Montana to address the economic impacts, both short and long term, for this COVID-19 pandemic. I can tell you that our membership has been a little discouraged about the way that money comes to Montana and then further gets distributed to its counties, cities, and towns. But we've worked collaboratively with the governor's office and this administration to make sure that we can seek reimbursement for Treasury-approved COVID-19 related expenditures. That process is ongoing. That process will be ongoing as CARES Act defines eligible reimbursement to last through the end of December of this calendar year. We will continue to work with the administration and continue to get the essential dollars out to local communities to fight this pandemic. But there's a long-term impact that none of us have really addressed and that hasn't been addressed with any federal legislation to date, and that's the significant economic downturn that will present itself in Montana for years to come. You had mentioned previously about the concerns that local governments have when they rely significantly on property taxes as a base of revenue to be able to provide those critical public safety and public health services. We will feel the pinch of this pandemic in the next tax collection cycle come November, and likely for the next couple of cycles after that, as we have issues with people struggling to pay their rent. Owners of those rental properties will struggle to pay their mortgage. People struggling to pay mortgages on commercial and residential property can get into trouble in terms of tax deed and potentially even lose their homes or their investment properties. And that's something that we have to make sure that we can avoid in any subsequent legislation. But I think more importantly, we need to look, and as I've counseled our membership, at both the short-term and long-term consequences of this pandemic. I think we're good with the short-term response in terms of making sure we have adequacy in police, fire, and public health, that testing is available. Still a resource that we need to continue to advocate for, but the short-term response is there. It's the long-term response that we're missing, and that goes to the piece that you addressed earlier in your opening, and that's the infrastructure. This pandemic may provide an opportunity for us to look at critical investments in infrastructure, just given the fact that our world has been turned upside down from March 12th to today. We are doing, on the local government level, business differently than we ever contemplated doing business in the past. The services that we're required to provide that can't be provided anywhere else in terms of recording of deeds, elections that still need to be run and administered by your local election officials. The public safety component, the public health component that continues to be essential during this pandemic and afterwards still needs to be funded. And it needs a different kind of critical infrastructure to be able to sustain that if we're going to continue to be as mobile and as flexible as we've been required to be in the early stages of this pandemic. So we're looking at federal legislation, we're looking at additional resources, and the most important part of any additional resources that could come our way for the benefit of our constituents in Montana would be direct money to local governments, cities, counties, and towns. The state doesn't need to act as an intermediary to be able to make sure that we shore up critical infrastructure in terms of personnel for public safety and public health, and critical infrastructure in terms of service delivery for our local governments. So we're eyeing that federal legislation cautiously and optimistically and advocating for direct aid to your local cities, towns, and counties. Because at the end of the day, that burden will be borne by property taxpayers or through federal assistance if it comes. And it's our preference at this point that we share that burden nationally, that this pandemic has caused nationally, and that we can shore up essential services and invest in our critical infrastructure.
Very good. Thank you, Eric. You know, we've talked a little bit about the fact that this economic hit is not likely to be felt at least as strongly by local governments until this fall. Tim, historically, infrastructure investments are made by local governments after they've funded things like police and fire protection and other core services. And in tight budget times, there's often little time left or little budget left for infrastructure. And we have the decaying roads, bridges, water and sewer systems across the state to show for it. In tough economic times, from the Depression up through the Great Recession, we've seen large-scale federal investment as a means of reemployment and rebuilding our nation's critical infrastructure. And you look across the state, and Fort Peck Dam is a good reminder of Depression-era investment and the lasting impact that's had just here in Montana. So it seems appropriate and even maybe apolitical to suggest that the feds have a role in our economic recovery at this point. Beyond that, we've been talking for a few years now about structural changes that may be necessary in how we fund local government, schools, and infrastructure. Does the current economic fallout from the coronavirus make you see things any differently about the roles of federal, state, and local governments and how we fund and deliver core services and infrastructure? And again, Tim, remind people of your role and what the League does here in Montana, and love to hear your perspective on not just COVID relief, but the impact on infrastructure.
Well, great. Thank you, Daryl. Again, my name's Tim Burton. I'm the Executive Director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, and much like the County Association, we provide advocacy services at the state, federal, and local level for all the incorporated cities and towns in Montana. We provide training, technical assistance to our members. And about 35 years ago, we created a pool that provides health, liability, workers' comp, and other insurance products to our members. And so we're a member service organization. We're governed by local leaders throughout Montana. And we're also members of the National League of Cities too, and we coordinate with that organization. Some of our members are presently sitting on that board of directors as well. As Eric stated, we're all in new territory. I mean, we had a pandemic back in 1918. This hit us hard mid-March. Both of us were fortunate to sit on the governor's COVID-19 task force. And at the time, the high priority coming out of that task force was, let's put the aid bills through the aid dollars through the CARES Act to work immediately for those businesses that have had to close, for people who've lost their job, and critically for those nonprofit organizations that provide critical health services to our members of our community. Knowing full well that there was going to be dramatic impact onto city and county government as well, but let's set that aside until we get the system in place for these immediate needs that our citizens are facing. And so we did that. As Eric mentioned, we've been working with the administration on how to allocate the CARES Act dollars for COVID-related expenses that are eligible under the law. We're about 5 or 6 months into that discussion now, and the money is going out throughout all the cities and counties in Montana to cover those costs. But the huge problem in front of us is, first of all, we've taken an incremental approach because we know what the situations on the ground are today. But that doesn't mean in 2 or 4 weeks that we're going to understand what the issues are there. It kind of ebbs and flows as we're learning, not only in Montana, but throughout the country. And so we want to make sure that we retain the resources to react to future unknowns down the road. We do know that the unemployment rate's as high as it's been since at least the Great Depression, and that it's not going to go away quickly. We're going to have to rebuild this economy over time. So what we're looking at, and as Eric mentioned, we know that property tax collections are down a couple percentage points right now. But most of our escrow funds were capitalized through the spring of the year. We have great concern on the challenges not only businesses but residential property owners who've lost their job are going to have when it comes time to pay your property tax bill in November. Having said that, we also know that throughout the country, the unemployment rate is high and cities and counties are laying people off, and these are the direct workers that are responding, police, fire, emergency services, healthcare workers, to the pandemic. And we're in a position where literally millions of people are being laid off at the local level that are critical to this response to the pandemic. So we're engaged in discussions right now and have been for the last couple of months on what a fourth bill might look like in Washington, D.C. There are different points of view on how that should work, but critically from our association, and we've partnered with the counties and through our sister organizations at the national level, we've got priorities that we're communicating to our elected officials back in Washington that we need to continue to assist our businesses that were required, our Main Street businesses that were required to close. We need to continue to assist the millions of Montanans and Americans who've lost their job due to the pandemic. And we need to continue to provide assistance to our medical service providers that are absolutely on the front lines of this pandemic. And then in addition to that, you know, the debate is taking place whether we open schools or not, but we critically need to have a plan and resources that assist our local school districts to safely open schools when the time is right. And in addition to that, we still will find that the unemployment rate is very large, that over the decades, the federal government stopped investing into infrastructure investments, and for many sessions, the state of Montana also did not invest into infrastructure. So that was the typical model, you know, until a couple decades ago, is that local, state, and federal government would collaborate on how to build water systems in a small town, or sewer systems, or highway systems, or road systems. Over the last couple of decades, that kind of went away. And it's not just the federal responsibility or a state responsibility, it's all of us playing together. We need to bring that approach to maintaining and building infrastructure back into a regular standard operating procedure. There's no doubt but that in Montana we have a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deficit, and at the federal level it's a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure deficit. And it's our grandparents and great-grandparents that made those investments that created the largest economy in the history of the world. And then we walked away from maintaining and improving those systems. And it's critical that we get back to work and do that so that our children aren't in a different position than we inherited. So what we would like to see out of a fourth bill is continued support for our Main Street businesses, continued support for the millions of Americans that are out of work, continued support for our medical system, which is overstretched practically anywhere you look. And also, we need to make sure that there's enough federal money that when the time is right to bring all of our children back into a schoolroom and all of our teachers back into the schoolroom, that they have the resources to do it safely. So in addition to that, you know, local government, both at the city and county level, are experts on building, maintaining, and operating infrastructure systems that are critical to our economy. We also need in a fourth bill the ability to stimulate the economy through significant infrastructure investments where everybody already agrees that our infrastructure is falling apart and it's not what it needs to be. This is an opportunity. I know that in other economic downturns, the federal government has relied on cities and counties to do just that. We've proven that we can get the results, and we need to make that a part of any fourth bill.
Very good, Tim. I think that's been a great encapsulation of what the ask is of Congress, and I have to say that I've been personally impressed with the response we've gotten from our congressional delegation. They understand the issues. I think they're working hard for Montanans. I think you've raised an important point, though, particularly in Montana, when I think about the emergent need for a response to the COVID crisis, and you've highlighted very well both the healthcare aspect as well as the financial aspect. But particularly in Montana, I think it really spurs an additional conversation about structural changes necessary in how we fund critical services. Things like police and fire protection, like our schools, like critical infrastructure, like roads, bridges, and water sewer systems. Tim, you alluded to the fact that the feds played a much larger role in funding some of those rural water systems 30, 40 years ago. They were paying up to 75% through grants and loans. Today, that number's down to 25% or lower. In Montana, the way we fund that is through property taxes. We have a whole lot of tourism in the state of Montana. We have millions of visitors every year that pay no impact fee on our infrastructure. We don't have a sales tax. We don't have another way except in resort areas. We don't have a way to collect an impact fee on our infrastructure. It's certainly driven a lot of conversation within the Infrastructure Coalition, but what does that make you think of in the midst of this conversation about COVID relief, about how we spur a long-term discussion about infrastructure funding? What's the fairest way, what's the most reasonable way to fund critical infrastructure in Montana that we all use and enjoy, including our tourism population?
Well, thank you, Darrell. That's a critically important question. And as you know, for the last couple of years in Montana, even up through the last legislative session, we've had that very discussion on what should Montana's tax structure look like. We've evolved over many decades, have relied on natural resource taxes to fill the void, and really for the last 4 or 5 decades, from the 70s at least forward, we've exempted a lot of property tax from taxation. So what that means over time is that much more of the burden is carried by residential and commercial property. The state relies substantially on income taxes. That tax has been growing over time and has, I think, more than adequately funded state services. The property tax, with a shrinking tax base because of exemptions and over-reliance on residential and commercial property. And remember, property taxes fund schools. About 70% of your tax bill goes to schools. About 20% goes to counties, and about 10% goes to cities. And people around Montana look and say, hey, my property tax continues to rise. And it does for a number of reasons. Where there's a community that's growing, they're blessed with a greater tax base. Many people, many communities throughout Montana approve voted levies, particularly for schools. So you vote that increase, and then you look at your tax bill and it's gone up. And then the state has restricted the local government's general fund to a growth rate of half the rate of inflation over the last 3 years average. So if you're in a small community in Montana that doesn't have a growing tax base and folks are not approving the levy, then you're in a position where you're forced to fund a police and a fire department at half the rate of inflation over the last 3 years, over the last 2 decades. Well, that math just doesn't work. So you end up cutting critical services and then put a pandemic on top of that, and you can imagine how these local resources are stretched to the max right now. It's true. We have tens of millions of visitors to Montana every year. And when we travel outside Montana, every hotel I stay at and every restaurant I go to has some form of a sales tax, where me as a visitor who's using local resources in terms of water and sewer and roads and sidewalks and may even have to call a police officer, I'm paying my fair share as a visitor. And we need to have serious discussions in Montana that be the same here. We're one of the few states that don't spread the cost that way. And as you know, through the House and the Senate, there were study committees put together. I think we were making good progress on those, but all that work's been interrupted because of the pandemic.
So Eric, you've been involved in some pretty interesting discussions in the Revenue Interim Committee meetings over the last several months. Would you like to share any insights on some of those recent conversations about maybe some shifting of how state revenues grow versus how local government revenues grow?
Sure, and I think it fits along with the discussion about the pandemic and the long-term economic consequences of this pandemic. Mr. Burton did a good job of talking about the way that local governments are allowed to increase revenues on a very limited basis, which is half the rate of inflation. But by doing that, we acknowledge costs increase at a certain rate, and we're only allowed to increase revenues by that half of that rate. It is frustrating. So what are the consequences for a local government that wants to keep up with service delivery or meet the demands of their constituents? You only have one choice. That is to send a question to the voters for them to voluntarily tax themselves for the additional service delivery. That could be a new jail. That could be additional law enforcement on the street. That could be the new school Mr. Burton mentioned. That could be an additional service in terms of parks and recreation programming, which we see often across the state. Trails, open space, all those over the last 10 to 15 years have resulted in a general reluctance of the voters to continue to tax themselves for services they think their local governments ought to be able to provide. So along the same lines, in the last legislative session, there were a number of bills that were aimed to grant additional resources to local governments to fund both critical infrastructure and the demands of their constituent. Things like local option sales tax proposals, gateway community tax proposals. You talk about that disproportionate burden that tourism has on Montana. You can name 5 or 6 communities in the state of Montana that bear the brunt of that, where adjacent to national parks or amenity destination tourist locations, the local communities and the local property taxpayers pay for that water and sewer system and those roads and bridges that are traveled on by our out-of-state visitors. We are fortunate to live in a state that is as beautiful as it is and attracts as many tourists as it does. But the burden is borne almost singularly by the property taxpayers in our state and in those communities to fund for those services. The state of Montana relies on income tax, both business income tax and personal income tax, which over the last 18 years has grown at about 6%. So 6% growth in their, which is basically 65% of their revenue in the general fund. They've experienced a 6% growth in the revenue opportunity to be able to spend and allocate those limited resources to services that the state provides. And remember, the services that the state provides are significantly different than your local government services. As a former legislator that always likes to say, unless you're involved in the criminal justice system or in family court disputes, the state provides very little services to you. Everything else is done by the local governments. So when they experience a 6% growth on their revenue in the general fund, where counties and cities are limited to half the rate of inflation, which works out to about, at best, 1.3, 1.4% growth, it provides an imbalance of service delivery. And we recognize at the Montana Association of Counties that the state is our partner in certain things and has some incentive to invest in critical infrastructure. We were successful a couple of sessions ago, primarily with the Infrastructure Coalition, to get an increase in the gas tax. But even in that gas tax increase, the legislature decided to carve it out and limit its use for very specific reasons, unlike the current gas tax, which benefits cities and counties and towns, but ultimately benefits the people using our transportation infrastructure. So I think that imbalance is there, and the headway that I think we've made in the HJ 35 subcommittee is recognizing that the current tax system in the state of Montana is unsustainable. Voters will stop voting themselves tax increases. They will eventually look to their government and say, you need to figure out a better way to keep pace with the increasing costs or limit the growth in government. To which I had a proposal that required the state to live with the full rate of inflation for business and personal income tax over a 3-year average and divert the rest of that money into infrastructure. Two things that the legislature historically has struggled with when they came into session at times when there was excess revenue that they didn't know what to do with, that caused turmoil and political fights. And when they entered into legislative sessions when there wasn't enough money to do what they wanted to do, that led to turmoil and political fights. We need to find a way to be able to limit the growth of government over a rational period of time, given a rational basis like the consumer price index or the cost of living, and then divert the additional revenues off into a way to invest in our infrastructure. That could be state infrastructure for bricks and mortar projects. That could be broadband implementation to offset federal grants that come in. That could be roads and bridges and water and wastewater projects all throughout Montana. That could be educational facilities. That could be tourist destination facilities to continue to incentivize people to come and spend their time and their money in Montana.
But unless we do something different with the way that we fund local government and services and start investing in infrastructure, we're left with the same choices that we've been left with over the last 20 years, and that is continuing to ask voters to tax themselves for increases. And that's not a long-term sustainable tax policy in Montana.
Very good. Thank you both. Any final thoughts on the ask that we're putting in front of our congressional delegation, or anything that we need to be asking the public to do to make sure that our delegation and the rest of Congress hears the need and understands the urgency of this request?
Well, we've been working with our congressional delegation for many, many weeks now, and clearly the priority, and if you have the opportunity as a resident of Montana to reach out, clearly we want to continue the assistance to Main Street business. We want to assist those who've lost their jobs because of the pandemic. We need to continue to invest mightily in those who provide critical health services throughout the state of Montana. Our local governments need a direct aid. All cities and counties throughout America need direct aid from the federal government for lost revenue and to maintain the critical capacity of our critical emergency service providers. And in addition to that, and talking to both of our senators and our representative, it's absolutely important, not only during the pandemic to get the economy going through infrastructure investments, but the federal government needs to go back and look at history and relearn the lesson that federal investments coupled with state and local governments are what help build the economy that we all enjoy here in the United States. So those are the critical important components of the discussion taking place in DC today. And for those of you who would like to reach out and make it clear that you support that, I think it would be very helpful.
I agree with Mr. Burton. I think another piece that's been missing in some of the dialogue at the national level is this idea of consumer confidence. We can put money into small business loans, we can put money into payroll protection programs, we can invest in unemployment insurance to keep the economy going as best we can and get money in people's pockets. But unless we find a way to reinstill consumer confidence, we're going to have a hard time coming out of this recovery. And I think part of the way that we reinstill consumer confidence is both through infrastructure investments. You have to be able to be relatively confident you can get down the road to get to market to a store that might be open at 50 or 75% occupancy. But when you get to town, you need to make sure that your public health officials have been there, evaluated plans for reopening, and have done everything they can to make sure that we are reopening our economy in a safe and productive manner. And if we don't have consumer confidence, and that consumer confidence means direct investment in your local government services, then this pandemic and the economic outcome of this pandemic is going to last a lot longer than any of us realized. So this fourth package as it comes through needs to address, as Mr. Burton said, business continuity, infusion of cash to make sure that we can keep our Main Street businesses open, the different mechanisms that we can put in place to make sure that the economy chugs along, but we have to focus on consumer confidence, and consumer confidence comes from local service delivery.
Very good. Thank you again.